Good afternoon. Welcome to the Division 17 Diversity and Public Interest Spring Webinar Series. We are so excited to have you here with us today for this webinar titled Taking Action Against Anti-Semitism and Intergenerational Dialogue. My name is Annalise Singh, and I'll be facilitating some of the question and answer at the end and also introducing the panelists. I have to tell you that the folks that we have here with us today to have this discussion, I have the utmost respect for. I think the issues that the panelists will be talking about have been very much present in our world over the last we'll just say a few hundred years, right, or more. I think we'll have a robust and dynamic and intersectional conversation about anti-Semitism and oppression. So I wanted to introduce your panelists to you. Dr. Saba Rashid Ali is a professor of counseling psych in the Department of Psychological and Quantitative Foundations in the College of Education at the University of Iowa. She is also the training and program director of the counseling psych program. She earned a master's in community counseling from Loyola University Chicago and her PhD from the University of Oregon. And she has two main research foci, including vocational development of rural psychologists and Islam in psychology with a focus on women's issues in Islam and helping psychologists to better understand Muslim Americans. Dr. Ali, thank you so much for being here today and for all the work you have done in our field. We have Heidi Data, who is almost a doctor, doctoral candidate in the Division of Counseling Psych at the University of Albany. She's currently completing her pre-doc internship at the University of Maryland's Counseling Center. Originally from Montreal, Canada, she completed her bachelor's and master's degrees at McGill University. She is licensed as a professional counselor in the province of Quebec, and her research interests have really been around clinical supervision and training, multicultural competence, and diversity issues in the supervision and training context. As of this summer, she will be an assistant professor in the Counseling Psych Master's program at Temple University. Congratulations, Heidi. They will be very lucky to have you. Another one of my sheroes, Dr. Amy Reynolds, an associate professor in the Department of Counseling, School and Educational Psychology at the University of Buffalo. She's also the director of training for the combined doctoral program in counseling psych and school psychology. She received her master's in student personnel work and her doctorate in counseling psych from Ohio State University and has been working in higher ed as both a staff psychologist and a professor for almost 30 years. Her work as a scholar, teacher, and consultant focuses on multicultural competence and counseling and student affairs. She has published over 25 journal articles and book chapters and made over 40 presentations at regional and national conferences. Thank you so much, Dr. Reynolds, for being here with us today. And Dr. Dan Walensky, what can I say about you? A brother and a friend and just a wonderful multicultural and social justice advocate. Thank you so much. He is an assistant professor of counseling in the Department of Psychology at Salem State University. He's completed his PhD in counseling psych at the University of North Dakota. His scholarship and teaching interests focus on social justice, multi-systemic privilege and oppression, and LGBTQ well-being. He has done so much within the division, as have each of our panelists, in furthering our conversations, really courageous conversations about some of the most pressing issues of our time. So I will now turn it over to our panelists, and I will pop back on for the Q&A session. For folks who are attending this webinar, please know that the webinar is recorded, and you can funnel questions to the panel through the questions box on your panel. So thank you so much for being here, and let's get started.
All right. Well, I think we were all going to take a few minutes and introduce ourselves and just talk about our decisions to be here. I'm so appreciative of this opportunity, and in thinking about how to talk about why I'm here, I thought I'd start out and tell you that something that I've never said professionally before. And I'm nervous about it. And that is to say that my Hebrew name is Sonia Ho Shula. And I'm saying that because I've never brought that part of myself into my professional world. And as I think about what it means to be a gay, white, Jewish middle-class person, cisgender male who grew up on the East Coast, surrounded by a lot of other Jewish people in context of a Christian environment. It seemed interesting to me that I felt such reluctance to bring some of my Jewish self into my professional world, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it's what I was taught to do as I was growing up. So I think that coming here and talking today about anti-Semitism it's been a real relational process that I'm so grateful to have shared with my esteemed colleagues and now with all of you. So I'm going to pause in my introduction and pass it over to Dr. Amy Reynolds to share a little bit about why you're here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Dan, for starting us off and for taking a risk, because that's what these dialogues are about. I know for myself, I was raised Catholic in a predominantly Christian environment until I went away to college. And so, like many people of privilege, it was not something that I really sort of examined in a relational way. I myself have gone through my own journey around my own Catholicism. I can say at one level that it's through Catholicism that I learned liberation theology because of my connection with progressive Catholic churches. But on the other hand, as a lesbian and as a woman, it's a place where I fought to even see if I belonged. And that's been a lifelong struggle for mine. And despite that struggle, my partner and I still chose to raise our children Catholic and then kind of let them go and see what they wanted to do. But it's never been an easy process for me. I would say at this point in my life, I identify as culturally Catholic, not as much religiously Catholic, because I feel like my Catholicism was so ingrained in me, it's kind of hard to unlearn it, to unknow it. And I guess that's true of all aspects of privilege as well. I was attracted to do this dialogue because it's through my work when I was at the University of Iowa, actually, and I was part of a Women Against Racism committee where I learned about myself as a white woman through dialogue, through relationships. And I felt like this would be the ideal way and place to not only myself benefit from this, but maybe for us to set a tone within Division 17 about how we can make progress in these areas. So I'll pause then and pass it on to the next.
So I'm Saba Rashid Ali, identify as Muslim American. Research interests have been around issues of what it's like to be Muslim American. I think one area of research, I've done some work with Lou Schlosser around how Islam and Judaism share history. And I think that has been really important work for me that I've done, because I think that with non-Christian religions or religious minorities in this country, it's really important to understand the history and the intersectionality and the commonalities of some of the religions and the experiences. And so that's something that's been really important to me. I think the other issue is that, I think among Muslim Americans, we have a lot of conversations about what it's like to be Muslim American. I imagine similarly, Jewish colleagues have similar conversations, but we don't have a lot of cross dialogue. And so participating in this, when Amy and Dan asked me to be a part of this, I was really honored, because the opportunity to have this cross dialogue among people who identify in certain religious minority groups, I think is really important. And how we come together to combat anti-Semitism has implications for how we come together to combat Islamophobia. So that's what's exciting to me about this, and I'm a little bit nervous about it, because it's not a topic that we've discussed, I think, as openly as we need to. And I'm sorry, and now I'll pass it over to Heidi.
Thank you, Saba. So I identify as a Jewish Canadian. In Canada, we tend to, interestingly enough, put our ethnicity first, and I think that kind of speaks a little bit to the context that I was raised in. My family members arrived after the Holocaust, and I lost many family members as a result of the Holocaust. And so talking about the Holocaust, remembering what that meant and what had happened to our family members was a huge part of my upbringing, as was celebrating my community's resilience. And yet, even though my Jewish identity is a core part of who I am, it wasn't until recently that I really started to grapple with how that identity really informs how I enter into professional spaces. And my training had really emphasized multicultural issues, but I would say that religious issues maybe were less emphasized. And so I've really lacked a vocabulary with which to dialogue about the ways in which I integrate my identity into the work I do. And I think typically I've had to, or felt compelled to, park my Jewish identity while engaging in social justice work. And so I was really excited about the opportunity to participate in a dialogue about issues that are really near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally, and really wanting to learn. I think we really learn through dialogue, and being able to be in the presence of such wonderful people with whom I've been really fortunate to build a relationship with through this process, just felt like a really great opportunity. And so I'm excited to learn and grow with you all today.
Similarly, thank you to this group of panelists. It's been such a profound experience to begin this set of dialogues, knowing that this was a topic. Anti-Semitism was kind of a topic that I've learned about through very relationally, through family members, but also through mentors, and learning about processes of oppression that I really do believe are inherently linked. And we're seeing so much of a rise in Islamophobic attacks, anti-Semitic attacks, xenophobic attacks in the last number of months that it seemed really important to do this. As we sort of began to put this together, some of it came up as questions about what anti-Semitism meant came out through both within Division 17 as well as outside of Division 17, and Jewish communities really grappling with one another about, for us in Division 17, some of it came up with the Black Lives Matter statement. And in other Jewish communities, there have been questions that have come up based on the movement for Black Lives taking a position on Israeli politics. And as I say that, I recognize I'm nervous to say the words Israeli politics as we begin this dialogue.
Yeah, we kind of talked from the beginning about how we can't not talk about or acknowledge that as a reality, but at the same time, we discussed, or I feel like sometimes that's where conversations go astray, where we get caught up in those conversations that people stop listening and stop hearing each other, because there's so much collective pain and so much intergenerational trauma, as we've discussed.
And I would completely agree with that. I think the other issue to it is that when it comes to politics and policy, it's hard to talk about it from a place of knowing all the angles and all the information. And you know, none of us hold degrees in policy or those kinds of things. So it's like the personal reactions to it, I think, are really important, and do have that pain component. And there's also the policy implications where we don't always understand what it is, especially going on in another country, because we don't experience it day to day.
I really love that you said that, Saba, because in having had the opportunity to travel, particularly to Israel, I've always been struck by how different the lived experiences are than what than what I might imagine it. And I too agree that it's a nerve-wracking, at least for me, very nerve-wracking to kind of think about the political dimensions and how that's created a lot of tension, brought up a lot of feelings. For me personally, I think we agreed as a group as well, is that we can't really begin to wrap our heads around that, to wrap our hearts around that, and that's difficult. And there is a relationship there, and so we have to name it, that there's a relationship between kind of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish oppression, and Jewish issues, and how that kind of gets discussed in the same sentence as more political aspects of the discussion. I think we saw that coming up in the division, and people having a lot of feelings about it, and I think some of that informed you know, some of the ideas around having this webinar.
I think sometimes oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Amy.
I was going to say, you know, I think sometimes it comes from a good place. I think sometimes sometimes in our effort to try to unify the world and understand how expressions of oppression play out in different parts of the world and see the linkages, I think sometimes we're shortchanging the complexity when we try to make those linkages, whether it be between, which has often been made, right, South Africa and Israel or whatever. People make these linkages, and I think with a good place to try to connect things, but I think sometimes it falls short. I know for myself, sometimes when I've had one opinion, the deeper I read, then the more confused I get. Go ahead, Dan, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, thank you, Amy. That was, I appreciate that. Heidi, you just talked about anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish oppression. Would you say a little bit more about how they might be similar or different?
Yeah, absolutely. I did throw that in there. Thanks, Dan. So, I mean, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're talking about hatred, oppression, acts of discrimination against Jewish people, people of Jewish descent. However, the word Semitic comes from a larger group, not necessarily just Jewish. Anybody with kind of Aramaic descent. So that is a more global term. Or a broader term. And so when we talk about people of Jewish descent, we're talking about people who include Ashkenazi Jews, so those are Jews that came from Eastern Europe. We're talking about, so including Ukraine, Poland, etc. These are the Jews that when we think about American Jews, we tend to think of these Jews. We tend to think of Jews that are phenotypically white. There are Israeli Jews, and so those are Jews living in Israel, and then there are Mizrahi Jews, Jews of African, from the African regions, and there are also Sephardic Jews, which include Jews who live in Iraqi Jews, Moroccan Jews, Iranian Jews, and so on and so forth. And so it's been argued by some scholars that anti-Jewish oppression is actually the more accurate or more specific term. And I think we discussed that that was really what we wanted to focus on in this dialogue, while also recognizing, as Saba mentioned, that all of our oppressions and our liberation are interconnected, and that we share a history and values and experiences that unite us.
As you're saying that, it's making me think about, the title of our webinar is Taking Action Against Anti-Semitism, and I've thought a lot about what that means in different ways, and thinking that one way that we've approached this really is relationally. And I shared with the folks on the webinar a model that actually my mom passed along to me, which is an organization called Salam Shalom, and it's a sisterhood of women, of Muslim and Jewish women who do a lot of work together and have agreed that in order to work together for 2 years, not to talk about politics and to build relationship. And it highlighted to me the importance of building relationship as a strategy for liberation, so that we can sort of care and then disagree, or agree.
I think one of the things we also talked about in terms of that preparation for the webinar is really the first point in building that relationship is to have these kinds of dialogue. And I love that example that you talked about, that your mom shared with you, because I think I read a New York Times article, I think I shared this with you all about, and a mom who said something very similar, which was start at points of connection. Like if you can agree with people that homelessness is a bad thing and should be eradicated, start with that point of connection of doing something about homelessness, and then sort of don't avoid the hard issues, but find the points of agreement first. Do good together, build relationships, and then tackle the harder stuff.
Absolutely.
So maybe one part of that would be, or one place to go with that with us, is to sort of say, where are the places about anti-Jewish oppression that we agree where action needs to be taken, both for ourselves personally, maybe within within SCP, Division 17, and more broadly within psychology.
Tall order.
Oh, we got 30 minutes, less than 30 minutes.
Well, I think one of the most important things to me has been to have this dialogue to begin with. We talk a little bit about this, and I know we talk about this in counseling psychology, but this idea that we should be multiculturally competent, anti-racist, activists around these kinds of issues without really much knowledge or personal connection and or practice, sometimes even talking about these issues. Sometimes we assume when students come to our program that they already have these values, and they may have the values, but they've never had the conversations. And so I think one of the most important things has been this conversation and trying to have more of those within the division, but in larger community engagement kinds of ways as well, is really opening up this dialogue and having these kinds of conversations about what is anti-Semitism versus anti-Jewish oppression. What are Jewish communities facing right now? What have they faced in the past? You know, these kinds of issues that I think it's really important for us to sort of immerse ourselves in. And I think that's something that I've been trying to do a little bit more, is really paying attention to what the current issues are.
As you say that, Saba, it's making me think about a process that I think I know I've experienced. I think a lot of other Jewish people I've talked to have experienced, of sort of invisibilizing anti-Semitism for lots of reasons. One, because a lot of European Jews and white Jews have blended in lots of ways in U.S. society, and you know, in relatively smooth ways, although losing something in the process, losing maybe some cultural values in the process. And I know that I don't always recognize anti-Semitism, or I've learned to sort of say that it's something else. And this is where it becomes intersectional for me. I remember growing up, and I remember a Jewish person who I went to school with who was visibly Jewish, in that he wore yarmulke all the time, he kept kosher, he practiced Judaism in a way that was more visible than mine. I was developing and becoming aware that I was gay. I was in 8th grade, and when this Jewish schoolmate, he was beaten up very, very directly for being Jewish, I dismissed that. I couldn't believe that it was because he was Jewish. Mm-hmm. And in that process, I engaged in invisibilizing that oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, Dan, because I think that there is a lot of loss in the process of being able to pass amongst, in particular, I think Jews who immigrated from Eastern Europe. And so I've thought a lot about like what that means when you are able to pass and all of a sudden, you know, come from a context where you were deemed a racial minority. And there's a lot of kind of articles on like how the Jews became white. And so this passing, you know, I benefit every day from white privilege. I do. There's no denying that. And yet, I think as a as a group of people who have kind of shed their identity, there's a loss of identity, but also I think a loss of opportunity to grieve and process trauma. And so the trauma comes up in so many different ways. And it really penetrates like the collective psyche of a group in terms of how, at least for myself and people I've gotten to know, really how we approach things, our kind of worldview. I think about this idea that we could, and this is something that I was really raised with, it could all be gone in a minute, that we had to be prepared for it all being gone in a second, overnight. And so any success was met with apprehension, and there was a sense of hyper-preparedness. And so when my grandfather, who I called Zadie, which is grandfather in Yiddish, when he died, we went to go clean out his apartment, and we found Ziplocs of money in the toaster oven, behind his bed, under a mattress, in the bathroom. And it wasn't a lot of money, but if you have to run, you're not going to the bank. And so there was this sense that, 50 years later, 30 years later, he was ready to go. And so what does that do? How does that get kind of passed on? And so it's no wonder that if you can be invisible, if you have the opportunity to pass, what do you do with that? So I think it's complicated. It gets really messy.
If we've had these conversations, and Heidi and Dan, to hear both of you sort of struggle with that, it just feels to me, even within a professional context or not, it's such too big a price to pay, right? Yes, you may have passing privilege, but at what cost? What has that done to both of you? So that even in professional context or otherwise, it feels like such a huge risk to be fully who you are. And that's in an environment, I'd like to think that Division 17, Counseling Psychology as a field, is a fairly welcoming environment relatively to other places and other spaces. So I can't even imagine what it would be like to then carry that burden even elsewhere out in the world.
One thing I'm also reminded of is I didn't say this in my introduction, but I grew up in southern West Virginia, so in the heart of kind of the Bible Belt. And one thing that occurs to me is that idea about passing, but also the issue of, growing up in such a Christian-dominated area of the country that in some ways I remember feeling like for myself that Christian was the norm, like that was normal. And, it wasn't until later on when I'd have conversations with Jewish colleagues and friends that I would realize that they grew up with similar experiences sometimes, and that what that meant for their identities and who they were. But it never really occurred to me because of the issue of most of the people that I knew who were Jewish were white. So I had never thought about what that narrative around Christianity being normal meant for people who were Jewish.
So appreciate hearing both of your perspectives. I think that's what's been so powerful about this process for me, is to really connect with people of different social locations, of different religious backgrounds. I think it really speaks to the relational piece, and I think also the kind of importance of being seen, within the division, within our community, and especially in light of everything that's going on. Me being terrified on a daily basis is really real for me right now. And so I think it's really powerful and really important that we are able to establish relationships where we can be seen, where we can be afraid together based on our, our different identities and experiences of marginalization. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, no problem, Heidi. That's pretty much what I was. I was going to say something similar. That there are so many opportunities, and this process has been about connecting experiences of oppression that are not identity based, but have a very shared, similar impact. Because it's scary, and I know that fear can manifest at different volumes in different places and at different times, and it's still there.
And we haven't really even acknowledged that, while we began planning for this long before the election, everything has really changed since that moment in terms of, like Heidi, the lack of feeling safe on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it feels like such a different world now, and which means these conversations are all the more important, so that people don't hunker down and separate from each other. It really seems so important.
One thing that I've noticed is I think the election has obviously been a very scary thing for many people, including myself, Heidi, so I completely share that feeling with you. I've also seen more connection in some ways. As we were talking about that, I'm thinking about after the Jewish cemeteries were destroyed, and seeing some of the Muslim activists that I really admire raising money. That was really important for me to see, because again, it goes back to that idea of connecting these things together.
That was also really important for me to see and experience too, Saba. I feel like it gave me a really such a great visible example of what matters. Are there other examples that people have seen that have been powerful?
I think the one that I'm thinking of the most, I mean, it's still the same example, but Linda Sorcerers, I know she's a very strong Palestinian activist and has some very specific sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, political views on things. But she was one of the main people who was involved in it. And so I thought, there's points of real disagreement, I think, with her and maybe Jewish activists and about Israeli politics, but you can still recognize that wrong is wrong, and the need to support people when something like this happens. That was, and I don't know that I'm articulating it very well, because it was a real emotional thing for me to see that this person who, like I said, is really strong into Palestinian rights, but holds the idea that Jewish oppression and anti-Semitism is just wrong, and could hold both of those things at the same time, if that makes any sense.
I feel like that's a little rare these days, right? So that we're in a place where if somebody makes one statement, then they're held accountable to that one statement that might not be popular among this group or that group. So I've seen a lot of articles, for example, that have attacked her and other activists for different stands that they've taken. And, I keep saying, and I tell my multicultural class this all the time, my phrase right now is, I long to live in a world that celebrates nuance and complexity. And I feel like that's not the world I live in right now, but it's the world I long to live in, where I can see that I disagree with someone, but that doesn't invalidate all their other points and all their other perspectives. I think it's hard to stay in that place sometimes, even for myself.
Yeah. I think about, I feel like a theme lately for me has been, I'm on internship, and so I'm doing a lot of clinical work and talking with my clients about, you can feel multiple things, that you can hold all of that. that the word but can be replaced with the word and, so that you can hold all of it. And so I feel like as a division, as a society, as, you know, as human beings, I just want us to be able, I want myself to be able to hold all of it, you know, to hold the complexity of the political situation while also being able to unite around issues of oppression, to feel like maybe at certain points it feels like some forms of oppression feel more urgent, some groups feel more targeted, and yet we're all in pain, we're all struggling, we're all afraid. Yeah, so I think like holding all of that feels really, really essential.
I think that this is, and this is my own process, I can't speak for anyone else, but part of holding all of it has meant, and I think that this has become more and more clear in doing this work with the three of you, has been holding all of it means acknowledging the the anti-Jewish oppression that is there too, which, as I've said, like, I sometimes deny. And so holding all of it means acknowledging what I experience so that I can bring all of myself to all of the other social justice work that needs to be done that is linked but not the same.
And I can imagine, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead, Saba.
Say that I can imagine, like, when you go there, and I mean, I kind of feel this way for me, and so I don't want to put this on you, Dan, but I'm sort of empathizing with the idea of when you hold that, the fear can be paralyzing. And it's like, how do I fight for these other things when I'm also feeling this scared?
Well, and I think the reality is, as much as we say there is no hierarchy, that doesn't mean that to oppression, that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel like there is at times.
Yeah.
Right? So we can say at this intellectual level, there is no hierarchy. But, you know, clearly within Division 17, there were pockets or large numbers of Jewish psychologists feeling like those issues were invisible and historically invisible, right? So while we can all say there's no hierarchy, to some individuals it feels like there is a hierarchy. And we shouldn't pretend that that's not how it feels.
Yeah. And if you don't have the relationships, if you don't have that trust, if you don't have that connectedness, then it's hard to talk about that. And it's hard to find spaces where you can hold all of that.
I really am thinking about it as volume at the moment, and trying to think about what's at a lower volume, what's at a higher volume, and recognize that even the sort of tracks that are sort of at a lower volume are still playing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And context. I found myself looking at subreddits for the alt-right in the last number of months, which is probably something I shouldn't do very often, and seeing a different type of language that is much more direct, that is much more specific and egregiously, openly violent toward Jewish people. That doesn't live in my everyday existence. Mm-hmm.
I think about the implications for training even, and I know my lens is on supervision and training, like how do we kind of help supervisees, you know, psychologists in training, myself, you know, really be able to kind of feel like they can feel the pain and integrate, bring their whole selves into the room, because I know that that's been a real struggle for me. I think that's where I have parked my identity. And it's made for a really fragmented experience in retrospect for me. And yet I really connect to what Saba's saying, because it's so painful to make sense of your lived experience in the context of being targeted in some way. And I think for me also what's been interesting is that I think I had kind of bought into this idea that anti-Semitism is more rampant, it's more direct, it's more in your face elsewhere, and so not in North America. And so having had the experience of going to, example, Poland and having stones thrown at me, I was like, oh, that's anti-Semitism. But that microaggression, no, that must be something else. And I think that that's been a process for me. And unfortunately, there are more overt, direct. I think the election's given people a lot more permission to hate. And so, you know, there's stuff there that feels pretty hard to ignore right now as well. And I've really benefited from having supervisors who take the time to let me cry about, you know, the fact that I'm scared for my toddler and where he might go to school and how do I be Jewish and raise him Jewish, and what does that mean for me?
I don't think we can you hear Annalise?
There we go. We're getting a few questions coming in, and I just wanted to pass a few of them on to you. So one of the questions came in early in your sharing, and it was, maybe it's a comment and a question. The struggle between being, anti-Semitism predates State of Israel politics by millennia. I think we must tease them apart. Can you tackle that one?
Sure, I think so. I think that does anyone else want to?
You can go.
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay. I think that, yeah, there's such a long history of anti-Semitism, and I can only speak. So okay, let me first recognize that I'm speaking from my own positionality, which is having been raised as an Eastern European Jewish person who's inherited a narrative about Judaism. And certainly what my understanding is that anti-Semitism was a very much more of a day-to-day experience long before the founding of the State of Israel. There's one model of anti-Semitism that I've read about in Europe that I thought was very interesting, which was that, you know, laws forced Jews to be tax collectors or bankers, and they were held sort of close to folks who had power, but almost served as like a buffer for those who were in power, so that the person who was identifiable as like the bad person was the Jewish person, and in that way protecting the folks who were in power. And the piece that I read about that actually brought that into context of the geopolitical relationship between the US and Israel, suggesting that in some ways Israel sometimes serves as a buffer for some of US policy. And I don't say that sort of in defense of Israeli policy, but more as sort of applying a model to current U.S.-Israeli relationships, which I actually don't know a ton about. But I thought that was an interesting metaphor, if not fact. What do others have to say?
Yeah, I think it's a great example that you're bringing up, Dan. And if anybody's familiar with the Merchant of Venice, that is where the trope of Shylock comes from, is this idea of money lending. And so there's this archetype of the court Jew, and a lot of the narrative around anti-Semitism, which predates the founding of Israel, it predates the Holocaust, you know, we're talking about 10th century here, pogroms, is really around scapegoating, and really kind of, you know, the Jew kind of state is positioned between the masses and the rulers. And so there's a tension there because Jews have been historically and currently unable to form alliances with other marginalized groups because of that positionality. So I think that kind of speaks to the flavor of anti-Semitism that I think has shifted and evolved, but that narrative has really persisted way before the founding of Israel or Palestine, or however you identify that region.
Well, and those are it seems to me, and I'm certainly no expert on this, but it seems to me that those are the anti-Jewish narratives that are often pushed based on that history that you talked about. And, you know, one thing I want to say is that we may have started talking more about the sort of Israeli-Palestinian politics in the context of opening up this webinar because of the listserv discussion. We're acknowledging, obviously, that this is a centuries-old issue and not something that just, you know, came about more recently because of the founding of the Israeli state. That's not, it was just in that context of where that discussion came up.
And I think that's what historically has led these conversations to have trouble going anywhere, because people look back into history so far and they say, we've made so little progress addressing these really hard issues, maybe it's not possible.
Well, and to pop in with another question, I mean, I think, Dr. Reynolds, what you're talking about is that hopelessness. Do we have these dialogues at all? And part of this webinar came out of just some conversations on the Division 17 listserv about a statement that was made in terms of support for Black Lives Matter and about African Americans. And I think there was a will, I think, in the association to have further conversations, and this is just the beginning of that. So a couple of questions have come in that are somewhat related. One is the struggle between being a privileged white person and an oppressed Jew, question mark. That has been confusing for me. I'm not sure if this person is saying that's personal for them or that they're finding it confusing to hear from the panel. And then one that kind of, I think, goes along with this is, and it's more of a comment, this person says, it is hard to process the hundreds of threats and attacks in North America in the last several weeks. It's made me feel vulnerable. It's going, both of these are going back to some things you've already talked about, but could you comment more on both of these?
I mean, I can go first and try to answer this a little bit. I think it goes back to the kind of piece about having white privilege and being Jewish is messy, and it is complicated because of Jewish history. And I think that there's an importance of holding both, right? And so it can be in dialogues, in racial dialogues, it can be kind of important to think about how Jews enter into racial dialogues. At least it has been for me, and I've done a lot of work recently with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here at University of Maryland around this topic, because there is an importance of kind of integrating both and recognizing, just like other identities, we all have ways in which we have been oppressed and ways in which we are privileged. And so how do we use the ways in which we've been privileged, or the power that we have, to empower? And how do we also find spaces where we feel seen for the ways in which we've been heard? And I think along those lines, yeah, the attacks have made me feel vulnerable. When I thought about doing this webinar to disclose, I think the first thing I thought about is I really hope I don't cry in front of all of these people, because it's been really, really hard and really difficult, and I don't have an answer for that. But what I can say is I think self-care is just so, so important, more important now than ever.
It's interesting that I had this conversation with William Liu, who is my colleague here, and I think he's working on a piece, so I hope this isn't a spoiler necessarily for his piece, but he's working on a piece about privilege really being contextual, and that talking about how almost it's really not, I mean, this may be going farther than he's willing to go, but that it's really not privilege, because when you walk out of a certain space, if you're not a white Christian male, white Christian heterosexual male, then you really don't have that privilege. He was thinking about, like, as a professor, as an Asian American male, as soon as he leaves our building, our Lindquist Center building, he's just an Asian American male on the street, you know. So that issue of privilege being so contextualized, and that, you know, that privilege is something you lose or gain depending on what room you enter in some ways.
Thank you. And I think I'm receiving a question via email. I think, you know, this panel, you represent an interfaith and an intergenerational dialogue talking about anti-Semitism. And a question that came in was kind of, I think this person was wondering about how this conversation may shift if people who are from Jewish identified, from an older generation, who had been within APA or other helping professional groups, how this conversation might shift if some of those folks were here today. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's part of the...
Go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say, I think that's part of the context, right? Our generation is part of what shapes us. And in any given moment, my generation, being raised in the 60s and 70s, born in the 50s, shapes my view of the world, both locally and not locally. So I think invariably that would be true, then compared to, say, Dan and Heidi versus somebody who's of more of my generation, although I'm not obviously of Jewish background, as I've said. But I think generation is important. And it would be lovely to continue to expand this group to have even more diversity of experiences, because I do think it would lead to a different conversation. I guess that's all I wanted to say, Dan.
I mean, I think that's similar to what I wanted to say as well, which is when I think about Jewish people who I know, both in APA and outside of APA, who are one or two generations older than I am, I think about a diverse group of people with a diverse group of feelings and opinions and beliefs. If I were to place this conversation in my family, it would look a little bit different. It would be, we would have to take one of those agreements to not talk about politics for a little while. Because we would, but the wonderful thing about that is we also love each other, and so the question is, how do we? I'm guessing that if we had folks, more Jewish generational diversity on our panel, we would have more diversity of opinion, because that seems appropriate. So I think then the question is, then we need to agree to open up more space if there's more diversity of opinion.
And how do you work on anti-Semitism in an intersectional way? I think that you all have been touching on this in many different ways in terms of, you know, there are many instances that are happening, who, you know, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, what's actually happening. But for instance, when you're, many of the people attending represent multicultural and social justice advocates in many different communities, and talking about these issues within really diverse communities can be really challenging, as you've shared. So are there a few guidelines that you have for us? We've got about 6 minutes left, and I wanted to kind of hear what you might do in terms of next steps for our attendees, what you would suggest.
You know, I've been thinking since earlier in the conversation that sometimes what happens is we're so busy doing the work that we're not doing the work. And I feel like engaging in this dialogue, although it's been short-lived, it feels like the first time for me in a long time I've been more being the work, both, you know, trying to locate myself personally and connect with other people. And I feel, especially as an academician, I'm so busy trying to produce work and train my students that you know, it certainly doesn't get valued. And so I guess for me, it's making a personal commitment to doing this kind of work, not in an activist context, but personal work is, I learned from my own work, trying to understand my white privilege, that without personal work, it's easy to just do this from the neck up, which, to be honest with you, part of this conversation today has felt that way. But given the limits and the time and the modality that we have here, I think that's understandable. But, you know, work just from the neck up without our whole essence is inherently limiting.
I think being aware of the spaces that we're going, I mean, Heidi, you brought this up, being aware of whiteness if you identify as white, and what that means going into various social justice locations and spaces is very important. And also thinking about if you identify as Jewish, what are the community norms? So how do I talk about social justice work within my Jewish community if there's silence there? Or how do I challenge both sort of in Jewish community and outside of Jewish community? And that to me very much relates to what you were saying, Amy, about being in this more than from the neck up, because I agree, unless there's a personal investment in it, it doesn't feel authentic, and it's limited in that way.
And I think, like, for me, the piece that I would add to what you've already contributed, which I really resonate with, is to kind of to ask about it, to ask about it, and to recognize that the effects of trauma are they're cumulative, right? And so for a Jew of color, they may be experiencing both racial trauma as well as Jewish ancestral trauma. And both of those experiences are really real and need some room to process. And I think above everything that we've talked about, and I think what I've taken away from this experience is to build those relationships, to really take time to build those relationships, and enter into each room with the goal of connection and compassion.
I like that.
And I think this might be the last question, but I do have a clinical example of dealing with anti-Jewish prejudice in session. And I will just throw out there that one person did wonder if, there were Sephardic Jews on the panel, or, Jews from other backgrounds, how the dialogue would shift as well. But I think you all have kind of addressed that with a previous question. But any anti-Jewish prejudice in session examples that you can share as we wrap up?
One thing that I can share, although it may not be exactly what, it may not respond exactly to the question, but I know that I've learned a lot from working with other Jewish people, that I can't, my understanding of Judaism differs very greatly from someone else's, and so what I understand about Judaism may not, may be completely different than what other Jewish people may understand, and I've actually found that I've had to do a lot of work to work with other Jewish people.
Yeah. I think the most common experiences for me have been swastikas showing up in educational spaces. It's been really difficult, and I have a colleague who I work with who is a Jew of color, and we've really spoken a lot about how he doesn't feel like he has a space to be everything that he is. And I imagine if he was seeking therapy, that would definitely come into the room, and that would be really important.
So I know it is 3 o'clock. The time went really fast. I want to thank each of you for being with us here today and getting us started on this dialogue. I think you each talked about this being a beginning. So I think we're hearing that in some of the questions we're getting. So if folks are interested in dialoguing with the panelists after this webinar, please feel free to contact me at asing@uga.edu, and I can connect you with the folks doing this work within the division. Thank you so much. And this webinar should be up on YouTube, so you will get some information if you're a Division 17 listserv member as to how to access that. And again, I hope everyone is doing well and working on issues of justice right now. Our next webinar will be exploring trans issues in supervision and counseling, so we hope you'll join us when we come back in April. So thank you again, and take care, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.